Iran just fired on Indian tankers. A French cargo ship was hit by a rocket. Two gunboats chased a 300,000-ton supertanker back through the world's most dangerous 21 miles of water. And right now, at this very moment, 20 million barrels of oil per day are sitting frozen in limbo while the global economy counts down to a full collapse. This is not a drill. This is not a simulation. This is the Strait of Hormuz in April 2026, and the world has never been closer to an energy catastrophe that would make the 1973 oil embargo look like a minor inconvenience. One choke point, one country, and the power to strangle every factory, every gas station, every hospital generator from Tokyo to London. That is the trap Iran has sprung, and the world walks straight into it. Let's break down exactly how this happened, how close we came to a complete global oil shutdown, and why the next 72 hours could determine whether crude oil hits $200 a barrel or whether the U.S. Navy blows the Strait of Hormuz open by force. To understand the magnitude of what's happening, you need to grasp one single number: 20 million barrels per day. That is the volume of oil that normally flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Not some of the world's oil. Not a portion. 1/5 of every single barrel of petroleum consumed on this planet moves through a shipping lane that is, at its narrowest point, just 21 miles wide. That's the distance from Manhattan to the Jersey Shore. And Iran sits on one side of it with mines, gunboats, anti-ship missiles, and a government that has absolutely nothing left to lose. What's your assessment right now? Does the U.S. have what it takes to reopen Hormuz by force? Type A if you think the Navy finishes this in days. Type B if you think Iran's mines and missile batteries make this a nightmare scenario. Drop it in the comments. Here is how the trap was built and how perfectly it was designed. The escalation began long before February 2026. It began in Geneva, where nuclear talks collapsed for the final time. Then came the air campaign, the June 2025 conflict between Israel, the United States, and Iran. 12 brutal days of airstrikes that shattered Iran's air defense network, obliterated much of its surface fleet, and, according to Trump himself, sent 158 Iranian naval vessels to the bottom of the sea. But here is what the Pentagon understood and what many in Washington refused to accept. You can destroy Iran's navy, and Iran still controls Hormuz. Because Iran's real weapons are not ships. They are mines, fast attack boats, shore-based anti-ship missiles, and the simple geographic fact that the world's supertankers must pass within range of Iranian coastline every single time they transit the strait. At exactly 3:17 a.m. on the morning of February 28, 2026, outgoing traffic through the Strait of Hormuz surged to levels not seen in years. Tanker captains read the intelligence reports. They understood what was coming. They ran. 50 massive VLCCs, very large crude carriers, each carrying 2 million barrels of oil, attempted to exit the strait before the window slammed shut. At least 3 were struck before they made it through. One was set ablaze off the coast of Oman. The fire burned for 9 hours. It was visible from 60 miles away. Then the U.S. strikes hit Iran, and the strait went dark. The numbers that followed were catastrophic. Oil prices detonated upward. Insurance premiums for a single tanker transit exploded from $250,000 to over $1.2 million overnight. Shipping companies ordered their vessels to stand down. The largest oil supply disruption in recorded human history had begun, not with a nuclear bomb, not with a ground invasion, but with gunboats and mines in a 21-mile shipping lane. This is what the trap looks like from the inside. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, spent decades wargaming exactly this scenario. They studied the 1980s tanker war. They analyzed every U.S. exercise in the Persian Gulf. They buried their command infrastructure underground. They dispersed fast attack boats in civilian harbors across the northern coastline. They stockpiled domestically produced anti-ship missiles capable of reaching targets 200 miles offshore. And they seeded the Strait with bottom-lying mines, contact mines, influence mines, remotely detonated mines that can turn any supertanker into a 300,000-ton floating fireball. The U.S. Navy's challenge is not finding these assets. It's the math. Minesweeping a 21-mile channel to a standard safe enough for commercial supertankers takes days, sometimes weeks. During that process, every minesweeper becomes a target for shore-based missiles. Every helicopter is within range of IRGC anti-aircraft systems in the hills above Bandar Abbas. And every hour the Strait stays closed, the global oil market bleeds another $3 billion. Don't miss what comes next. Subscribe to Navy Force USA right now so you never miss an analysis like this. By April 12th, the picture had clarified into something terrifying. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance led a delegation to Islamabad for direct talks with Iranian negotiators. Pakistan's army chief served as intermediary, a signal of how isolated and cornered Iran had become diplomatically. The talks collapsed. Within hours, Trump announced a U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports, a counter-blockade of the blockade. He posted on Truth Social that any ships targeting the American blockade would be immediately eliminated. The world now had two competing blockades in the same 21-mile corridor. Think about what that means for the tanker captains sitting at anchor in the Gulf of Oman, watching the geopolitical chess match play out while carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil and waiting for someone to tell them it was safe to move. On April 18th, Iran declared the Strait closed again. 2 Indian-flagged vessels came under fire from Iranian gunboats. The VLCC Sanmar Herald, a 300,000-ton supertanker, received clearance to pass, then had Iranian gunboats open fire on it anyway. India summoned Iran's ambassador in Mumbai. The CMA-CGM Everglade, operated by the French shipping giant CMA-CGM, reported rocket damage off the coast of Oman. Iran's parliament speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, announced that reopening the Strait was impossible as long as American forces maintained their blockade of Iranian ports. 2 blockades, 0 tankers moving, and 20 million barrels per day sitting paralyzed. Here is the energy math that is keeping energy ministers awake at 3 a.m. across every capital in the world. China receives 1/3 of its total oil imports through the Strait of Hormuz. Not some oil, 1/3. China's strategic petroleum reserve holds roughly 1 billion barrels. That sounds enormous until you realize China burns 15 million barrels per day. At that consumption rate, a complete Hormuz shutdown drains China's buffer in under 70 days. After that, Chinese factories start rationing power. Chinese refineries start idle cutting, and a Chinese economy running below capacity is not just China's problem. It is every supply chain on the planet's problem. Japan is in an even worse position. Japan imports 90% of its oil from the Persian Gulf. It has limited strategic reserve capacity. A sustained Hormuz closure is not a crisis for Japan. It is an existential economic event. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, the entire industrial backbone of East Asia, runs on Persian Gulf, crude piped through this 21-mile corridor. Combined, China, India, Japan, and South Korea account for 69% of all oil transiting the Strait. Every single day the corridor stays shut, the bill compounds. Support the channel. If this kind of deep tactical and strategic breakdown is valuable to you, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It's what keeps Navy Force USA running. And the ripple effects extend far beyond oil. Here is a detail that almost nobody is talking about. The Persian Gulf is also the world's single largest source of urea fertilizer. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and Bahrain together account for over 1/3 of global urea supply. Urea is produced from natural gas. It is the primary nitrogen fertilizer used in grain production across Asia, Africa, and South America. A sustained Hormuz disruption does not just raise fuel prices, it raises food prices. It potentially collapses grain yields across developing nations that cannot afford to substitute fertilizer. The humanitarian math beyond the energy crisis is staggering, and it unfolds on a slower timeline that makes it even more dangerous because it arrives after the TV cameras have moved on. Now, the United States is not without options, and those options are frightening in their own right. The U.S. Fifth Fleet is headquartered in Bahrain. Multiple carrier strike groups have been operating in the region since the conflict began. The Navy's minesweeping capability, while not as robust as it was during the Cold War, includes MH-53E Sea Dragon helicopters, the Avenger-class mine, countermeasure ships, and unmanned underwater vehicles specifically designed for mine detection. The plan, when authorized, is to create a cleared shipping lane wide enough for VLCCs and defend that lane with continuous combat air patrol, surface escorts, and anti-ship missile suppression fires against IRGC coastal installations. The problem is execution time. Clearing a mine threat in contested waters under fire is not a 2-hour operation. Intelligence estimates suggest initial clearance of the primary shipping lane could take 72 to 96 hours under optimal conditions. Under actual combat conditions, with Iran's remaining fast attack boats harassing minesweepers and IRGC shore batteries engaging escort vessels, the timeline extends dramatically. And every hour of that timeline costs the global economy billions. The United Kingdom is leading coalition planning with more than 40 nations. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer convened an emergency summit. France and the UK have been pre-positioning naval assets. NATO allies are in motion. But Trump's relationship with NATO has been visibly strained throughout this conflict. He publicly stated his disappointment that NATO members weren't there for us, and coordinating a multi-nation maritime escort operation while managing those political fault lines adds another layer of complexity to an already nightmarish operational picture. What would you have done if you were commanding the Fifth Fleet on April 18th when those gunboats fired on the Indian tanker? Escalate immediately and open the channel by force? Or hold position and let the diplomatic track run another 48 hours? Give me your answer in the comments. This is exactly the kind of decision that determines whether wars expand or contract. Iran is playing a game with deeply asymmetric stakes. For the IRGC, every day the Strait stays closed is leverage. It demonstrates to the Iranian population that the regime survives. It imposes economic pain on China, which purchases 90% of Iranian oil exports and has its own reasons to want this resolved. It forces the United States into an operational dilemma where the cost of forcing the Strait open may exceed the cost of continued negotiation. And it allows Iran to charge up to $2 million per transit as a toll for vessels it selectively permits through, a revenue stream that funds the war effort, while the regime's conventional military forces lay at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. This is not recklessness. This is calculated desperation from a government that understands it has been militarily shattered and is now fighting for its survival with the only weapon that actually matters: geographic control of the world's most critical energy corridor. The history here is important. Iran has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz dozens of times across 4 decades. Every time before, the threat worked as deterrence without actual closure. Tanker insurance spiked, oil prices jumped, diplomats flew to capitals, and the Strait stayed open. The military strategic logic was always the same. Iran needed the Strait open to export its own oil. Closing it hurt Iran as much as anyone else. February 2026 changed that calculation completely. When the U.S. and Israel struck Iran's nuclear infrastructure and conventional military forces, Iran's oil export capacity was already heavily sanctioned and partially disrupted. The regime calculated, and may have calculated correctly, that it had more to gain from closing the Strait than from keeping it open. The asymmetry of the situation had finally flipped. And right now, as of this week, the world is living inside that calculation. Rystad Energy, one of the world's leading oil market analysis firms, projects it will take until July for oil flows through Hormuz to reach 90% of pre-war levels. After that, it takes another 2 months for barrels to arrive at refineries around the world. We are looking at a supply disruption that extends into the fall of 2026, compressing global petroleum inventories, keeping jet fuel prices elevated, and transmitting inflation through every energy-intensive sector of the global economy simultaneously. This is what the Hormuz trap looks like from the outside. One regime, one choke point, and a global economy that spent 30 years refusing to build the infrastructure to bypass it. The UAE has a bypass pipeline, the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, with a capacity of 1.8 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline can carry 5 million barrels per day to Red Sea ports. Together, that bypass capacity reaches roughly 7 million barrels per day. The Strait normally carries 20 million. The bypass gap, the volume that simply has no alternative route, is 13 million barrels per day. 13 million barrels per day sitting in the Persian Gulf with nowhere to go. That gap is the actual weapon, not the gunboats, not the mines. The gap. The strength of free nations is ultimately their ability to act in concert when the stakes demand it. The coalition forming around this crisis, 40 nations coordinating naval escorts, diplomatic pressure across every capital, economic alternatives being explored at emergency speed, represents exactly that capacity. But the test is whether that coalition can move fast enough, whether the diplomatic track produces a result before the military option becomes unavoidable, and whether the world, having walked into this trap once, will finally build the redundancy in its energy infrastructure to ensure it cannot be trapped here again. Because here is the final truth about the Strait of Hormuz that every government on Earth is confronting right now. The trap was always here. Iran didn't build it. Geography built it. Iran simply had the desperation and the moment to spring it. History will judge whether the world was ready. Was Iran's decision to close the Strait of Hormuz a desperate last move by a defeated regime, or a masterstroke that exposed a critical vulnerability in the global order? Drop your analysis in the comments. And if you made it this far, you are the core of this community, the people who want to understand what's actually happening beyond the headlines. Subscribe to Navy Force USA, hit that notification bell, and share this with anyone who wants the real picture. Because this story is not over, not even close.